Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Start a Podcast with Joe Casabona from Creator Courses. Joe, thanks for joining us today. In just a few minutes, I am going to turn everything over to Joe, but I just wanted to go over a couple of things. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat. Let us know what you want to know about, and Joe's going to try to address those at the end. This will be recorded and in our partner portal. So if you are not already a Liquid Web partner, but you want to be, so you can get access to this education piece and pieces like it, then you can email me at lmiller@liquidweb.com, and we'd be happy to get you all set up. Without further ado, Joe, take it over. Tell us how to start a podcast.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for that great intro, Lindsay Miller. I am here to talk about how to start a podcast. Usually I'm wearing my podcasting hat, but it's Yankees opening day. I love baseball, so that's the hat that I'm wearing today. I'm going to go ahead and maybe share my screen here. If I just had it, and now I'm not sure where it is. Let's see. There it is. Show keynote. Yes, that's exactly what I want to show. Alrighty. So today we're going to talk about how to start a podcast. You can find these slides and all of the resources over at casabona.org/podcasting. So let's see, can you see that I've just changed my screen? It says pause, so I'm guessing not. All right, we'll just have to do it the old-fashioned.
Okay, now I see the new slide.
All right, we'll have to do this the old-fashioned way then, without being in presenter mode, and that's okay. So I will bigify this so you can focus on my slide. And I'll zoom in a little bit too, just to make sure that everything is looking good. All right. So first, let's talk about what podcasting is. And the dictionary definition, I know that just like using starting a presentation with Webster's dictionary says, but I do want you to get a good idea for what people think podcasting is. The practice of using the internet to make digital recordings of broadcasts available for downloading to a computer or mobile device. What does that mean? Basically, I explain podcasting to my parents as internet or radio on the internet. Instead of doing an hourly show every day on the airwaves at the same time, I record a show, I release it at the same time every week. A better definition could be found in this quote right here that I have highlighted on the screen. For many, podcasting is the logical next step from blogging. And I think that is a really good way to think about it. And so does Seth Godin. Seth Godin wrote a blog post back in October called Podcasting is the New Blogging, saying that it's not always a way to make big dollars, which blogging also doesn't do, but it's a proven technology that's still in its infancy, and it is the generous act of showing up, earning trust and authority because you care enough to raise your hand and speak up. In other words, podcasting is a way to get your message to thousands of people. So if you're not going to make a ton of money podcasting, why should you even podcast? Well, there are a few reasons why you should start podcasting if you're thinking about it. And I suspect that if you're here watching this, you already are thinking about starting a podcast. You should podcast to build your audience. So you can build your audience over time, just like people who started blogs in like the mid-2000s did, right? They didn't start with a giant audience, or most people didn't, but they built up their audience slowly over time. You can establish your authority in a specific field, again, much like blogging. And I should say that I think that podcasting today is where blogging was in like 2004, where a lot of people were doing it, but it was still mostly like technically competent people, And now it's getting easier and easier to just put your podcast out there in the world. And I think it's going to explode over the next couple of years. So podcasting is a way to establish your authority. You start a podcast on how to do X, you show up every week and you talk about how to do X, and people will start listening to you. You can also gain a loyal following, and this is really important because podcast listeners are very loyal folks. The main difference between something like blogging and podcasting is you are in your listener's ear every week for 40 to 60 minutes, right? So people are listening to you. I usually describe it as a more intimate setting because people usually have their headphones on or they're listening in their car, on their commute, something like that. And you're actually talking to them and they get to know you that way. So podcast listeners become very loyal because they feel like they know you after a while. And then, of course, lastly, it's a way to get your ideas out there. So you can publish your podcast and talk about whatever is on your mind or whatever you're thinking about in a particular field. In other words, podcasting is a way to get your message to thousands of people. And throughout the rest of this presentation, we are going to talk about the things that you need to do to start that podcast to get your message to thousands of people. And that starts first with choosing a topic. So before we actually talk about choosing a specific topic, you should answer a very important question. Why do you want to start a podcast? And again, there are lots of reasons why you might want to start a podcast. Build an audience, increase revenue streams, try the technology, repurpose old content. I know people who take old blog posts, update them, and release them as podcasts. And that's a great way to get your sea legs a little bit, right? You can practice starting a podcast and you can use old content so you're not putting a ton of time into scripting it out. But the why is really important because the why dictates the rest of this journey for you. If you're just doing it to make money, it's going to be tough. Podcasting is a grind, and most podcasts don't necessarily turn a direct profit through something like sponsorship. What they can do is increase your authority, and if you are a freelance web designer who starts a podcast on the best tools for web designers, maybe you can get clients or consulting contacts that way. But if you really do just want to put information out there to the world, start with the why and let that kind of trickle down into the rest of your decision making. You also need to be passionate, okay? So you need to pick a topic you're passionate about. Like I said before, podcasting is a grind, and you need to love your topic to keep doing it. And a lot like blogs, it's okay if somebody else is talking about it because you are using your own voice, right? You can say what other people have said, but nobody can say it like you're saying it. So similar to blogs, just because somebody else has a Disney blog or a Disney podcast doesn't mean that you shouldn't start your own Disney podcast. Make sure you use your own voice and your content is good. So that is how you should come up with your topic. An example I like to use is I'm passionate about a couple of things, right? I love podcasting and teaching. I'm a web developer, so I love web design. And then I also love cigars and Disney and the drums. And so those are kind of my hobbies. When deciding how or why I should start a podcast, I decided to go the route of web design, web development, starting an online business because I already had an audience in that field. It is what I do day in, day out, and I'm also really passionate about that stuff. If I started a podcast on cigars, I consider myself a cigar novice. So I would have to become an expert very quickly, or at least enough of an expert to understand some of the nuanced topics as my podcast grows or gets, as I add episodes. But I also have to build an entirely new audience. Most people who follow me on social media or on my newsletter don't really care about cigars. The same thing goes for Disney. I love Disney. I know a lot about Disney, but I'm not in that space. So I'd be starting from scratch at ground zero. And if my why was to become someone who's known in the Disney space, maybe that's the reason I started Disney podcast. But my main reason was to establish authority, promote some of my other businesses, and I was lucky enough to get sponsors early on, so increase my revenue streams as well. As you're deciding your topic and your show, there are a few formats that you can choose. So there are several types of podcasts. There's the solo podcast, news or headline podcast, host, co-host, interview style, and heavily produced. Let's go through each of these very quickly. A solo show is the easiest to produce because you're doing it by yourself, right? It's just you. You don't need to schedule with anybody and make sure everybody's on the same page with what you're talking about. But doing it by yourself can make it hard to get motivated, right? If it's just you showing up every week, you don't have somebody to push you to also do the show, then if it doesn't take off quickly, you might think, this isn't really worth it. It's all on you at that point. A news headline show is basically you go through 2 or 3 headlines a day or a week. The Tech Meme Ride Home podcast is a very good example of this. They just kind of pick 3 tech headlines per day and give you the gist. It's a great, quick format show. You just need to curate the right stories, right? And that's something that people might be into. But that can get monotonous, right? Because you're just kind of doing the same thing every day. If you have a solo show, you can change up the topic or the format. News headlines can get monotonous pretty quickly, especially if you don't want to opine very much, right? If you just want to present the facts. Host, co-host, this is good because you split the work with somebody. There's somebody else pushing you to make sure you show up, right? Especially if you guys have a set time that you record. You also split the spoils, so you both promote, or you and your multiple hosts promote and can grow the show. But if you are in it to make money, just know that whatever money you do make, and it could be very little early on, is going to get split multiple ways. And then scheduling can get hard, right? If you have multiple hosts, if somebody can't make it one day, do you go on without them? Do you reschedule? These are all things that you need to think about with a host co-host format. Interviews. I have an interview podcast, so I'm a big fan of them. They are fun because you get to learn a lot of new things. Mine came out of the general inquisitive nature of me asking people about their business. But it is a lot of work scheduling new guests. You have to come up with a list, reach out to them, get them on your schedule, make sure they're willing to come on and figure out a topic and all that. You should also do a little bit of research on your guest, right? Don't necessarily go in cold. I don't do a ton because I like to be surprised. I like to hear information as my audience is hearing it. And so I like to kind of be surprised by a lot of the information. But you should know like how to pronounce their name, what they do on a daily basis, so you can start asking relevant questions. And the audio quality may vary. So you might have a really good podcast setup, but your guest might be recording from like a phone in a gym auditorium. So there are several ways to mitigate that, but just keep that in mind if you're going to do an interview show.
Hey, Joe, I'm going to interrupt you real quick because something that you did with me whenever I was a guest on your podcast, you asked me to like do my own audio recording. Would you like talk about that a little bit? Because I've only done a few guest podcasts, but you were the first one that asked me to do that, and I thought it was really unique. So that's a good tip to tell everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big things to think about is that if you're recording with somebody, say over Skype or Zoom, you're going to hear a reduction in audio quality that's coming to your computer because it gets compressed by the program before it's sent to you. By having your guest record their audio locally, you are getting the full, uncompressed, best possible sounding audio, right? So that is definitely one thing that I send to all of my guests. I say, we're going to be recording this. I'm going to record a backup via Zoom or via Skype. but if you could record your side of the audio, that will ensure that it's not going to get compressed. Also, if there's some weirdness in the internet connection, right? We've probably all been on calls where you get that robot voice. I don't want that robot voice showing up in my show. So having them record their own audio locally and then sending it to me later prevents that robot voice from happening. Was there anything else there, Lindsay, that I should touch on?
No, that was perfect.
Awesome.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I
Oh,
thought that was a
no.
unique thing I wanted you to tell everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, like, I stole it from Shop Talk Show. Chris Coyer and Dave Rupert had me do that when I was on their show. Finally, the heavily produced show, right? This is like the serials of the world, and they can be incredibly engaging. It could be really fun to do fiction, right? I think there's one called like Dr. Death. There's another one by How Stuff Works called The End of the World. And they could be really fun to do, deeply investigated shows and stuff like that. But these are among the most expensive and the most time consuming because they need to be heavily researched, scripted. If you're doing fiction, you're going to need to hire actors probably, and then add sound effects and be in a sound studio, right? This is why pretty much it's the big podcast networks or the big corporations that can fund these sort of things. Serial was less like that. They had a good setup, but it was done by a few, like a team of investigative journalists. And so, again, it could be incredibly engaging. I have one in the works that I would love to do if I can get the right funding, but it is very expensive and very time consuming. So there's something to think about there. So once you do have your topic, it's time to pick a name. And I can speak pretty heavily on this because I picked a name that I thought was really good, How I Built It. I got the domain howibuilt.it, and then about 3 months later, NPR released a podcast called How I Built This. So you can imagine I was very upset, but I was attached to the name, so I decided not to change it. When you pick your name, pick a name that communicates the show's message, right? Something like the Joe Casabona Show is not going to grab people unless they already know who Joe Casabona is, and most people don't, right? But like I think like the Joe Rogan Show, people know Joe Rogan and apparently can listen to him for 3 hours. So make sure to pick a name that communicates the show's message. How I Built It is, I think, a very good one because it answers the question, how did you build that? The same thing with something like I think Liquid Web has a show called the E-commerce. I definitely should have double checked this before coming on here, but the Shop
Show
Owners
Builders podcast.
Yeah, exactly. So getting that if you're a shop builder, you're going to learn some stuff, right? Do a search on iTunes to make sure it's unique enough and that it stands out, because you want to stand out. Podcasting is growing, and if you have a bunch of shows that all have the same name, you're going to be vying for some stiff competition. You're going to be vying for listeners. So make sure that it communicates the show's message and that it's unique and stands out. And then immediately grab the domain and the social media. Again, with How I Built It, I grabbed the social media and before NPR did. And they haven't asked. I mean, they probably have like NPR, How I Built It or something like that. But I get tagged a lot for tweets that are directed at them. So I jumped on making sure I got the social media for the name and the domain that I was able to grab. The same thing goes with artwork. You're going to want artwork that stands out. First of all, when choosing artwork for Apple Podcasts, their podcast feed contains artwork that's a minimum of 1400 by 1400 pixels. That is a large square. Maximum size of 3000 by 3000. And then it needs to be JPEG or PNG, right? So this is something that you can use Photoshop for, or Canva. For Google recommends just like a gigantic square between 1200 and 1200 and 7000 by 7000. So you can use the same icon for Apple Podcasts that you do for Google. Everything else basically steals from Apple Podcasts, so you don't have to worry about like coming up with a bunch of different pieces of artwork for every podcast directory. And when it comes to creating your artwork, you can use Photoshop, Illustrator, GIMP, and Affinity Pro are like the mainstay photo editing tools that have been used for a long time. If you don't know, GIMP is like a free version of Photoshop. And then Adobe Spark and Canva are free. Well, I think Adobe Spark comes with Creative Cloud, and Canva is like freemium. But those are both web-based. I've been using Adobe Spark more because it works really well on iOS, and Canva until recently did not. But Canva is a really popular tool that I'm also a big fan of. And basically, the way I'm not a graphic designer or anything, but when I create artwork for my podcasts, I basically have some icon for how I built it. It's a hammer, and then the words how I built it designed in a nice way. For my other podcast, Creator Toolkit, it is a icon that is a toolbox that I got from Canva with Creator Toolkit underneath. So when you're working with a small amount of space, you want to make sure that the title is readable and the artwork stands out. You don't want it to be too busy, right? So I usually do like a solid color, contrasting icon and title. And you can look on the Apple podcast directory for really good examples.
I'm gonna plus one you on this one too, Joe. I am not a tech savvy person, and we actually had a question come in through the dashboard as well that relates to this. But I use Canva for everything, and I've had people actually reach out to me and go, "Hey, would you create this like thing for me?" And I was like, "Oh, I need you to understand something. I don't use Adobe. I don't even know some of those tools that you're mentioning here. But I can end up creating some really decent looking graphics for quick things I'm doing or starting up, or as people could just like be at the very beginning of their podcast. They don't want to hire somebody or reach out to somebody who knows how to use Adobe Photoshop. They can go into Canva and create something that looks professional, right?
Mm-hmm.
And can get that across. But it's a good non-tech savvy thing to use, and it's something if I can use it, anybody can, I think.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And they've got really good templates that you can build off of too. Like I said, I am not a graphic designer. I am absolutely a developer, but I've been able to come up with some nice looking things thanks to Canva and Adobe Spark's templates. All right, so this is the exciting part of it, I think, for a lot of people. Finding the right gear, right? Finding the right podcasting gear. If you got to look at me before we started screen sharing, you'll know that I have a microphone hanging off a boom arm right in front of my face. I have a whole blog post about my personal podcasting setup. I'm going to fill you in on something right now. My podcasting setup is like upwards of $1,000. You don't need that at all. And I didn't have it when I started out either. But as I started to do more podcasting and recording online courses, which is my main gig now, I wanted to make sure that I had absolutely the best sound quality that I could get in a home office. But you can spend $100 or less and still have a good setup. So what do you absolutely need? You need a decent microphone. I say decent because most people are not going to recognize super good, like the difference between like good audio quality and super good audio quality. They're listening in their earbuds or in their car or their AirPods, and those are not like high level studio monitors. But there is also a bottom of the barrel, unlistenable as far as audio goes. And like recording it on your phone in an auditorium that's super echoey is it. So there are things that you can do to mitigate audio quality, and a decent microphone is one of them. And I'll make a recommendation in a few minutes. A pop filter is that big foam cushion that you saw on my microphone in the beginning. What it's supposed to do is slow down the air going into the microphone. So when you have plosives, like the P sound, it doesn't absolutely like pop right into the microphone. A boom arm is optional, but it keeps that's the thing that has my microphone suspended. It keeps the microphone off the desk so that if you are like banging on the desk, you probably heard that. If you're banging on the desk, that shock doesn't go into the microphone. And then headphones. I recommend headphones so you can hear yourself to make sure that there's no major issue. Pop filter, boom arm, those things are going to depend on the microphone you get. So the big question with the microphone is, do I get a USB microphone or an XLR microphone? Here's the big difference. A USB microphone is one that plugs directly into your computer. An XLR microphone is like the microphones that you see on stage, right? They have like that big cable coming out of the back of it and like plugging into an amplifier or a mixer or a PA system. And the big difference between them is an XLR microphone, all of the hardware inside the microphone is for improving the sound quality. With a USB microphone, you have some stuff to improve the sound quality, but most of it is going to be like circuits to also connect to your computer. So in general, you can get better sound quality from an XLR, but you need a separate piece of equipment to plug in the XLR. It's called an interface. You plug your XLR into that, and then you plug the interface into the computer. A USB microphone, again, plugs directly into your computer. And that's usually what I recommend to most people. And specifically, I recommend either the Blue Yeti, which you see pictured here, or the ATR 2100. That is a typo right here on this slide. The ATR 2100 by Audio-Technica. Both of these microphones are really good for first-time podcasting. They're very forgiving of the environment, especially the ATR 2100. So if you are in like an open or echoey room, they're very forgiving of that. The Blue Yeti runs around $100. You can usually get it on Amazon for around $100. And the ATR 2100 will run around $60. So those are the two microphones I can get. It looks like those are being posted into the chat. There's also like a whole list of recommended equipment over at casabona.org/podcasting, including pop filters and boom arms that match these two microphones. For anybody who's curious, my setup is the Shure SM7B, and I'm plugging that into a Universal Audio Aero, which is an interface and a mixer, and it's very nice, and it's a very simplified setup. So if you are looking for a microphone, again, I will recommend the Blue Yeti or the Audio-Technica ATR 2100. Both of those are USB microphones, and they're very easy to set up, and they're very forgiving of a lot of environments. So now let's talk about recording and saving your podcast and editing. Well, I think we're going to talk about editing later, but recording and saving your podcast. So first, let's talk about improving your recordings, right? And we talked a little bit about this. A good microphone will help the most because a good microphone will give you settings to like filter out certain sounds or have a pattern where you just talk directly into the microphone instead of picking up like sounds from behind the microphone. That was sounds from behind the microphone. So a good microphone will help with that. There's also ways to deflect and dampen the sound. Again, if you remember what my setup looked like before we switched to screen sharing, you might have noticed that I have two big bookshelves behind me. On the other side of my monitor, I also have these big foam panels. What both of those do is they prevent sound from bouncing around my room and back into the microphone. They will deflect sound and they will dampen the sound. You don't have to pay like a ton of money if you're handy. It could cost like $5. Really, what you're aiming to do is just prevent echoing from happening because that can seriously cause poor audio quality. I also know people who will grab their microphone and put like a comforter over their head and the microphone, and that works insanely well. Mike, oh my gosh, the Dirty Jobs guy, Mike Rowe, has talked about how he's done that when he's had to record from home. He would go in a closet with a comforter over his head to prevent outside noises and echoing. Wear headphones because again, you can monitor yourself, and that will make sure that like no sound comes out of your computer and interrupts the audio that you have. And a pop filter and a boom arm will also help because they're going to do things like prevent you from hitting your microphone or shaking your microphone and soften those plosives. As far as capturing audio goes, if you're solo, Audacity, GarageBand, and Windows Recorder are all free. Audacity works for both Windows and PC. GarageBand comes with your Mac, and Windows Recorder comes with your PC. I have used all of these. They're all perfectly fine. Audacity and GarageBand also allow you to edit audio, which is nice. So if you plan on editing your own show and you have a PC, Audacity is probably the way to go. When you have a co-host or a guest, make sure both of you record locally. Even if your guest doesn't want to download Audacity or GarageBand, they can use QuickTime to record their audio or Windows Recorder if they're on a PC. You can also use something like Skype with Ecamm Recorder for Mac. That's about $35, and that will record a 2-track audio where your voice is on one track and your guest's voice is on the other. Or a Multo for the PC. That's freemium, so it's free, but if you pay for it, you get the multi-tracks as well. So that's really nice. And Skype is like generally what a lot of podcasters will use to record interviews. I've started using Zoom a lot more because it has the recording functionality built right in, and more people in my space tend to use Zoom than Skype nowadays. But I'll also, like, if my guest is like, I don't have Zoom, I'd rather use Skype, totally fine. And then there's a web-based solution called Zencastr. I think there's no E on that. That's probably Zencastr. That's a web-based interface where you connect to this website. You're given an ID. You send that link or that ID to your guest, and then you're in like this recording room. And Zencastr will take care of recording both your audio and your guest's audio locally and uploading it to your account. I've used it and it's been okay. I tried to combine them and I had some what's called audio drift, where we started off at the same spot, but then I started to get ahead of my guest, so it made for a really weird conversation, and I never went back. I just tend to have both my guest and me record our audio locally. When it comes to editing, there are, again, a few options for editing your show. First of all, if you don't want to edit, if you just want to like do it live and send it out to the world, that's your prerogative. I will generally recommend editing for if you mess up and you want to do a retake, for cleaning up the audio, like if there's background noise that you might be able to get out. If there's background noise while you're talking, that's going to have to stay in there, right? Which is why it's really important to have a good environment that dampens and deflects sounds. Because if like your dog is barking while you're talking, it's impossible to get that barking out and still keep your audio in. So environment is everything, but editing can help. How should you edit? You can do it yourself or you can hire a professional. I edited approximately 3 episodes myself before I hired somebody, because the things that I was trying to do took me 3 to 4 times as long as the episode is. So if I'm doing a half-hour episode, it took me 2 hours to edit. And with a professional, it's like closer to a one-to-one relationship, because there are like things that they can do and automate, and they can spot check, and maybe they listen once all the way through. So I hired a professional pretty early on. Again, if you don't have the funds to do it, or if you just want to try editing on your own, you can use something like Audacity or GarageBand. The professional tools are Adobe Audition is the audio editor if you have Creative Cloud, or Logic Pro is the one that's used most primarily on the Mac. That one costs around $200, I think. If you're an iOS, if you're like living the iOS life, there's a really good iPad app called Ferrite where you can record right into it and edit. That'll take a little bit of muscle memory change, but I've heard really good things about that by and large. So, and that's like 20 bucks, I think. So,
Did you say that was called ferret, like the animal?
almost Ferrite. It's Ferite.
Okay, I was like, I hadn't heard
Yeah,
of that anyway, but okay,
yeah.
that New York accent got me there for a second.
Yeah, that's good. You can always ask me again when I talk because I know that people have a hard time understanding me. Um, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm from New York. That just came as like a shock to them probably. But I will say that I've got my daughter saying coffee now instead of like the Philadelphia coffee, so I'm really excited about
Right. Well, it's a Midwest girl that has to ask for pronunciation stuff.
that.
But anyway, okay, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, no problem. I'll be sure to include that in the resources page too. Um,
Thank you.
if you are looking to hire, oh, yeah, perfect. Doing it yourself versus, I'm getting ahead of myself. I forgot I had slides about this. I was like, I thought I did, and then I got ahead of myself. So do it yourself versus hiring out. Um, do it yourself if you want to learn or if you have no budget. But like start small, right? Um, if you say a lot, trying to get all of those out is going to be really time consuming. But one thing I recommend if you know you need to reshoot something or re-record something is when you're talking, you've messed up. Let's say you're saying, "Hey, how everybody, welcome to how I built this." I should have said how I built it. I will clap my hands, and that will create a slim, straight line in the audio. And then I will re-say what I needed to say. But I know that that slim straight line is where I need to edit, right? That's fun fact. Whenever you see people saying like talking about movies and they have that black and white like clapper thing, that is to help editors know where to edit. It creates that again that long slim sound. So or that long slim sound wave that you know where to edit. So do it yourself if you want to learn or you're just starting out and you're trying to like shoestring like I did. Hiring out doesn't have to be really expensive. My first editor was on Fiverr. My second editor I found via Fiverr. So he doesn't cost $5, but he's very affordable for the things that I have him do. I'm not asking him to like completely master everything. I'm asking him to like bleep out swear words and like mix all the tracks together. Because again, that's something that would take me a long time to do that I am sure takes him decidedly less time. So again, it depends. Uh, do it if you have time, or don't if you have the money to pay for an editor. I think paying for an editor is one of the best investments you can make if you don't intend on editing podcasts for a living. It also depends on how much control you want over the show, right? So if you are doing something highly produced and you want that look and feel, maybe you should edit it yourself. Um, Unless you're extremely good at communicating all of the things that you want. Again, with my designer or my editor, I can basically put things in a text file and explain how I want them because I spent some time editing, so I know the terms. We've been working together for a while, so I know he knows how I word things, and I can experiment a little that way. So tools of the trade for editing. Audacity, GarageBand, Logic, and Adobe Audition, which I mentioned, and then Fiverr and Upwork are good places to find affordable editors when you're just starting out. Now, professional audio editors will tell you this is why you should hire a professional. Absolutely. If you have the budget to hire a professional audio editor, go for it. There will be a noticeable difference. But if you don't have $300 an hour to pay an editor, then Fiverr and Upwork will. I mean, they do a great job. You know, the editor that I found does a really great job for how I built it. He combines everything. I make sure the audio quality is best as possible, and he cleans it up a little bit. So that's if you're going to hire an editor, Fiverr is, I've had good luck with Fiverr. Okay, so far we are more than halfway through. So I'm going to go through this section really quickly. Basically, we're going to talk about where your podcast should live. A podcast should have its own dedicated website. This allows for a central place for your content, for your RSS, and for your canonical links. RSS, really simple syndication, is what that stands for. This is needed to get your podcast to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You need an RSS feed for your podcast. And then canonical links. What does that mean? It means that you have a single source, the one true source for your content. For my episodes, people can go to howibuilt.it/the episode number 116. This is where I send everybody. Now that redirects to something longer, which is the actual canonical link. But the point is, I'm not saying if you listen on iTunes, go here, and if you listen on Android, go here. I'm saying go to this page, and you'll find the audio, and you'll find how you can subscribe however you want to subscribe. So setting up a good website for your podcast can also help it grow. I feel like having a good website for my show has helped it grow to I think 650,000 downloads over 2.5 years. So I am a big advocate for this. And the 4 things you absolutely need for a podcast website is a good domain, which we talked about, good hosting, which I will recommend Liquid Web, as we are here for that, and that's where my podcast is hosted, WordPress, which Liquid Web is very good at hosting, and a podcast plugin. It's up for debate whether you absolutely need WordPress, right? But we'll get to that. Number 1, a good domain. Choosing the right domain is really important. I think a .com is really important because 80% of people will try the .com first, or in this case, .fm, because a lot of podcasts like to do that. The only problem is a .fm is like $85 a year, and a .com is like 10 or 13. Make it short and make it speakable. If your podcast has a number in it, the domain, let's say I'm starting a Lord of the Rings podcast called the one ring to rule them all.com. That's bad for a lot of reasons. That's a lot of words. And also, is it one spelled out or is it one the digit? So make sure to pick a short domain that is speakable and unambiguous. Make it memorable. Try to match it to the show, right? Howibuilt.it. People are going to remember that because they always think, how did you get the .it? And have alternatives available. So that's what you should do when choosing the right domain. Good hosting. You're going to want easy WordPress setup, good support, Let's Encrypt for SSL, backups. And the reason I mention it here is because it should be different from your media or audio hosting. So your website is hosted somewhere, let's say Liquid Web. Your audio should not be hosted on Liquid Web. It should be hosted somewhere different on a separate audio host because they specialize in that, which means that it's going to be faster because they specialize in serving up audio files. If your site ever goes down for any reason, your podcast will still be available because you're using a separate audio host. Most podcast hosts or audio hosts also have advanced analytics, so they can tell you how many downloads you're getting, where those downloads are coming from. And most of them also have a custom or customizable audio player, so you can make it look really nice as opposed to just uploading an MP3 to your web host and hoping for the best. The good audio hosts that I recommend are Libsyn, which I use for my main podcast, Blueberry, Castos, which I use for my other podcast, and Castos also has killer WordPress integration, the best that I've seen. So I would recommend Castos for 2 reasons there. And Simplecast is an all-in-one solution that will host a really nice looking website and your audio all in one place. A relative newcomer is Anchor.fm. A lot of people ask about that because you can record directly to Anchor from an app on your phone, and then it'll upload it. You can even do some basic editing, and it'll submit it everywhere. This is by far the easiest way to get a podcast online, and I don't think it's a bad way. I think it really depends on what you need. If you're just dipping your toes in the water, try Anchor, because it's free, and it'll really help you understand the process, I think, without like a million steps in between. Hosts you should avoid: SoundCloud, because, well, they're like constantly in a flux of, are we going to go away? But also, they don't really specialize in podcasting hosting, right? It's mostly for musicians to upload like their 3-minute or 4-minute song, not for podcasters to upload their 60-minute episode, right? That said, I just found out that a podcast that I listen to, a very popular one, uses SoundCloud. But in general, I haven't heard good things about SoundCloud. So I'll recommend Libsyn or Castos. WordPress. Why do we need WordPress? We don't need WordPress for a website, right? But here's the thing. WordPress can streamline the entire website process for you. It's got a lot of things already built in. Podcasting is like a blog in that each week you post a date-sensitive piece of content. It's used by over 30% of the web, which means it has a really strong community. There are a lot of really great tools for podcasting on top of WordPress, including Castos. And you can easily add other stuff like a blog or a shop or a community as well, which is something that you won't get from some of these other tools that specialize in podcast websites and podcast hosting. So I recommend WordPress because it's your own site that happens to also be where your podcast is hosted. And then a podcast plugin for WordPress. When you're evaluating a podcast plugin, consider if your podcast host has a WordPress plugin. Also, bears repeating, have a separate audio host for your podcast. Every host that I mentioned has a separate WordPress plugin. Make sure it has Apple Podcast compliant RSS feeds. The ones I'm going to recommend do. If they don't, your podcast will not make it to Apple Podcasts. Look at the features. How customizable is everything? And does it play nice with other themes or plugins? Here are two good ones. There is Castos, which you see right here, and Seriously Simple Podcasting, which is made by Castos, and PowerPress, which is made by Blueberry. I use both of these, and they're both very good. So I would recommend either one of those. I think Seriously Simple Podcasting is better because of its tight integration with Castos and the fact that it creates parity between Castos and your website, which is something that the other ones don't. So it'll always make sure that your website is in sync with Castos. Content as well. And lastly, let's talk about submitting your podcast. You should submit your show to Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. These are the 5 big directories that every other podcast app or directory pulls from. So if you're going to submit it to only one, submit it to Apple Podcasts. But these 5 places, you could submit your podcast for free, and it'll get your show in the ear of the most listeners. As far as tips for submitting, first of all, have an episode 0 that just introduces the show. Because when you submit to Apple Podcast, it requires that you already have an episode published. So create an episode 0. Hey, this is Joe Casabona. I want to tell you about a new show that's coming out very soon. That way, when you upload episode 1, it's not an anticlimactic like, hey, we're launched, but we're not really because we're not anywhere. So have an episode 0 first. Get on to Apple first, or Apple Podcasts first, because they are the biggest. 60% of my podcast traffic comes from Apple Podcasts. And from what I understand, that's pretty standard across the industry. And many of the smaller podcast apps just pull from their directory. A good audio host should help you get your show published. This is another reason I like Castos. But if you're using your website for your own feed, you might be on your own. And each host submission each directory's submissions process is slightly different. On casabona.org/podcasting, I have links to how to submit to everywhere except for Google Podcasts, because with just about everything with Google, if you put a podcast out there and it exists and is indexable by Google, Google will just handle everything automatically for you. So those are my tips for submitting. Wrapping up, because we want time for questions. Pick a topic and format that you're passionate about. You don't need the best audio setup starting out, just as long as you don't sound like you're in a tin can. Have a website and one source for your show. That's really important. And lastly, podcasting is a grind. You're probably not going to be an overnight success, or you will, in the sense that every overnight success happens over 10 or 20 years, right? But you're not going to get like 10,000 downloads on your first day. So just remember that going into it. It's a grind, but it's a lot of fun, and it can be very rewarding. So thanks so much for watching. I'm Joe Casabona. I'm a developer, teacher, and of course, a podcaster. You can find me at casabona.org. And of course, the resources are over at casabona.org/podcasting. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Be sure to stick around till the end of the questions, because I do have a special offer for people who attended this webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. That was fantastic. I started like a little podcast, and I even had my mom doing one now. She's a naturopathic doctor, and she started using Anchor FM on your recommendation, and it's gone really
Nice.
well. And now I've learned some tips for my own podcast that I do. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We do have a few questions that are coming in, and so I want to get those in. I do want to remind everybody that this recording will be in the partner portal at Liquid Web. And so if you don't have access to that, you can email me and find out how you can become a partner and get pieces of education like this from Joe today and others that we add all the time. That's lmiller@liquidweb.com. Okay, so first question. So you said podcasts are 40 to 60 minutes in length, but we're seeing a lot of different time lengths going. Do you, as our podcasting expert, have an optimal length of time for a podcast?
That is a fantastic question, and I'm also an educator, like I teach in the classroom, so I'm going to answer it in the most frustrating way a teacher can, which is it should be as long as it needs to be. Now, I say that because, I personally think podcasts should be less than 45 minutes to an hour, right? Because that's a big time commitment. However, some of the shows I listen to border on 2 hours. Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss, who have some of the biggest podcasts out there, go 3 to 4 hours. So if people are listen to your listeners, if they're willing to listen for 3 hours, which by the way is bonkers to me, then it could be that long. Really, you should think about the content and the takeaways, right? Again, in the case of both Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss, they are there to just have a conversation with a well-known person, and most people just like listening to that and gleaning pieces of information. With How I Built It, my personal show, I want people to have specific takeaways based on my guest. So 2 hours, people aren't going to have that specific takeaway. They're going to forget what we talked about in the first 20 minutes. So I try to keep the interview to 30 minutes for that reason. All depends on the purpose of your show.
Yep. Okay, perfect. So going back to like the blanket over the head or soundproofing a room or anything else like that, what is just a basic tip other than like getting those headphones and listening to yourself of testing that sound quality to make sure that like what you have is fine? One of the people attending said that they try to do great. They think it sounds fine to themselves. And then other people listen to their podcast and they're hearing echoes.
That's a really good question as well. So having headphones plugged in so you can hear yourself will help with that, right? Because you're actively monitoring your audio. A lot of like the 2 microphones that I recommended actually have a headphone jack plugged or like directly in the microphone, so you can get a direct line to hear how you hear. If you don't have something like that, use QuickTime or Windows Recorder and just record a quick test. Do the intro. When I'm testing out a new microphone setup, I always do the same thing. I say, "Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of How I Built It, the podcast that asks how did you build that." Today, my guest is Bill Gates of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Same way every time, because I have a baseline for how that's supposed to sound.
Yeah,
And
that's perfect.
and it's a pipe dream, right? I would love to have Bill Gates on my podcast.
Right? Okay, so you're probably going to know who this one's coming from, but they wanted to remind us that you have common law rights built in with how I built it. And also wanted to say one more tip from the audience is when you're Google searching, when you're looking at other podcast titles, is to do a basic trademark search and see if anyone else owns the trademark of that name already in podcasting.
Yes, that is great advice from a great person. Uh, and I would strongly recommend her services as well because she helped me out a lot when I was going through whether I needed to change my name or not or what would happen. So,
And okay,
yeah,
then let's go ahead and give a plug. Who was that?
that was Ryan Kinney. She's at the Kinney Firm on Twitter. She's really fantastic. She helped me get my first trademarks, and like I said, I talked to her about what this NPR thing meant for me. So I would strongly recommend her, especially because she's in the technical space, so she understands what a lot of people in my position are going through.
All right, perfect. Well, those are all the questions I have from the audience. Thank you again, Joe, for doing this for us today. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us. If you want to find Joe, you can find him at creatorcourses.com. I'm sorry, is that where we're sending everybody? Creatorcourses.com.
Uh,
And find,
yeah,
yeah, sorry. Okay,
yeah.
yeah, you have several things going on over there. And you can also find out more about Liquid Web at liquidweb.com or reach out to me at lmiller@liquidweb.com. So thank you all for joining us. Until next time.